It was a chilly autumn afternoon when Elijah Evans, one of the wealthiest men in the city, found himself aimlessly strolling through a neighborhood he hadn't visited in years. The sun was hidden behind layers of thick clouds, and a light drizzle fell upon the streets. As the owner of multiple enterprises and a man with assets stretching across continents, Elijah rarely had the time for a simple walk. But today, something in the air tugged at him, urging him to break free from the confines of his office, if only for a moment. He wasn't sure why his feet had led him to the outskirts of the city, an area long neglected by urban developers, where the grandeur of his world didn't seem to touch. The buildings were old, worn down by time, their faded facades speaking of a past when they were lively and bustling. Now, they stood like silent sentinels, watching over streets that were barely alive as he walked. Hands deep in the pockets of his expensive overcoat, his mind drifted. His life, from the outside, appeared perfect. He had the luxury cars, the sprawling mansions, the powerful connections, and a team of advisors always ready to fulfill his every whim. Yet, despite the opulence that surrounded him, there was a persistent emptiness gnawing at his core. An emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. He paused at a crosswalk, gazing at the narrow alleyways that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. It was there, just beyond his line of sight, that he saw her. At first, he wasn't sure if she was real. A woman huddled on the corner, her body wrapped in tattered blankets, her figure almost blending into the shadows of the alley. She sat on the cold pavement, her back against a dilapidated building, a weather-beaten cardboard sign in front of her that read, "Homeless, hungry, please help." Elijah hesitated, his heart caught in a moment of conflict. He had encountered beggars before, hundreds, maybe even thousands in his lifetime. In fact, his driver was often instructed to avoid the streets where they were known to congregate. But something about this woman stopped him in his tracks. There was a rawness to her, a vulnerability that seemed to pierce through the heavy layers of his indifference. She wasn't young, nor was she old. Her face, though caked in dirt and grime, held a certain beauty that had long been forgotten, perhaps by herself more than anyone. Her eyes, though dim with exhaustion and suffering, were still vibrant, as if the spark of who she once was hadn't yet been extinguished. Without thinking, Elijah crossed the street and approached her. His polished shoes clicked against the wet pavement, and as he got closer, he could smell the faint scent of decay, the unmistakable stench of the streets, of survival against impossible odds. She didn't notice him at first. Her head was bowed, her thin, bony fingers clutching a threadbare blanket around her shoulders as if it were her only protection against the world. When Elijah stood before her, she finally looked up, her eyes meeting his. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to fall away, leaving only the silent connection between two vastly different lives. One of immense wealth, the other of abject poverty. "Do you need help?" Elijah asked, his voice soft but steady. The woman blinked at him, as if she couldn't believe that someone like him, a man dressed in the finest wool coat, with an air of importance and privilege, was speaking to her. It took her a moment to respond, and when she did, her voice was raspy, barely audible. "I just need a little to get by," she whispered, her eyes lowering to the cardboard sign at her feet. Elijah crouched down in front of her, his knees bending in a way they hadn't in years. He was close enough now to see the deep lines etched into her skin, the evidence of a hard life, and the weight of countless nights spent on unforgiving streets. He could see the way her hands trembled slightly as they gripped the blanket tighter around her frail body. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, though he wasn't sure why. Part of him wanted to leave, to turn his back on this brief encounter and return to the comfort of his office. But another part of him, an unfamiliar part, wanted to stay. The woman shook her head slowly. "Too long," she murmured. "But time doesn't mean much anymore." Elijah's hand slipped into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of his wallet. Inside, he knew, were hundreds of dollars in cash, money he barely even thought about. But something in him hesitated. It wasn't the money that mattered. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite grasp. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. The woman looked at him, her brows furrowing in confusion. "My name?" she echoed, as if she hadn't been asked that question in years. She hesitated, her gaze shifting to the ground, before finally whispering, "Evelyn." Evelyn. The name resonated in Elijah's mind, though he couldn't place why. It was simple, unassuming, but there was something about it, something that tugged at a distant memory. He shook the thought away and pulled out his wallet. Inside was a crisp $100 bill, and his fingers curled around it reflexively. He thought about handing it to her, but something stopped him again. Instead, he pulled out 3 $100 bills and added a $50 to the mix, folding the money together and holding it out to her. Evelyn stared at the bills in his hand, her eyes widening in disbelief. For a moment, she didn't move, as if afraid that reaching for it would make it disappear. "Take it," Elijah said softly, his hand still extended. "It's for you." Slowly, hesitantly, Evelyn reached out and took the money. Her fingers brushed against his as she did, and Elijah felt a strange sensation. An inexplicable connection, fleeting but undeniable. As she clutched the money to her chest, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You have no idea what this means." Elijah stood up, his knees cracking as he rose, and nodded. "Take care of yourself, Evelyn," he said, though he wasn't sure if those words held any real meaning. With a final glance at the woman who had somehow stirred something deep within him, he turned and walked away. As he continued down the street, the drizzle turning into a steady rain, Elijah couldn't shake the image of Evelyn from his mind. Her face, her voice, the way her hands had trembled when she took the money, it all lingered with him, refusing to fade. He tried to rationalize it. He had given money to countless people over the years. He had donated millions to charities, built shelters, funded hospitals. But this was different. This was personal, though he couldn't understand why. Evelyn was just a woman on the street, one of thousands, a nameless face in a sea of suffering. And yet, something about her stayed with him, haunting him like a ghost from a past he didn't remember. Elijah returned to his office, but the sterile luxury of the space did little to quiet his thoughts. As he sat at his desk, the city skyline stretching out before him, he found himself wondering where Evelyn had gone. Was she still in that alleyway, huddled beneath her blanket? Or had she used the money to find shelter, to get something to eat, to reclaim some semblance of dignity? For days, the questions gnawed at him, distracting him from the meetings and the deals that usually consumed his every waking hour. He had everything: money, power, influence, but he couldn't stop thinking about the woman he had left behind in the rain. And so, a week later, Elijah found himself back in that same neighborhood, standing on the same corner where he had first seen Evelyn. But this time, she wasn't there. The alley was empty, the cardboard sign gone. He looked around, searching for any trace of her, but there was nothing. It was as if she had vanished, leaving only the memory of their brief encounter behind. Elijah stood there for a long time, the weight of his unspoken questions pressing down on him. He had given her $350, a small fortune for someone like her, but he realized now that it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the connection, the inexplicable bond that had formed in that moment, when two lives from opposite worlds had collided, if only for an instant. As he turned to leave, Elijah felt a strange sense of loss, though he couldn't explain why. Evelyn was gone, and with her, the fleeting sense of purpose that had gripped him during their encounter. He was left with only the echo of her voice and the haunting realization that, despite all his wealth, there were some things he could never buy. But Elijah Evans was not a man to be easily deterred. Something told him that this was not the end of the story. There was more to Evelyn than met the eye, and for reasons he couldn't yet understand, he felt compelled to find out what that was. And so, with a determination that surprised even himself, Elijah set out to uncover the truth about the woman who had left such a lasting impression on his soul. Years before Elijah Evans became the man known throughout the city for his wealth and influence, he was someone else entirely. His life hadn't always been defined by towering skyscrapers and glittering soirees. Once, his world had been small, intimate, and filled with the kind of love that made everything else seem irrelevant. But like many things in life, that love was fleeting. slipping through his fingers like sand, leaving behind only memories and a hollow ache that no amount of money could ever fill. In his younger years, Elijah had been driven by more than just the hunger for success. Back then, it was hope that propelled him forward, and hope had a name: Lila. Lila had been the light of his life, a woman whose presence could brighten even the darkest corners of his mind. They had met in a bookstore on a rainy afternoon, both reaching for the same worn-out copy of a novel neither of them would end up reading. The moment their hands touched, there was something, an undeniable spark, a connection that felt as though it had been waiting for them all along. They laughed about it, embarrassed at first, but that simple, serendipitous moment became the start of something neither of them could have anticipated. Lila wasn't like anyone Elijah had ever known. She had a quiet wisdom about her, a grace that was effortless. Where Elijah was ambitious, always looking toward the future, Lila lived in the present. She had a way of grounding him, pulling him out of his head and into the world that was right in front of him. Her love for life was contagious, and for the first time, Elijah felt like he wasn't chasing something unattainable. With her, he was enough. They were inseparable, spending long evenings talking about everything and nothing, their conversations filled with dreams and laughter. Lila had a deep love for nature, often pulling Elijah out of the city and into the countryside, where they would wander for hours through fields and forests. She taught him how to slow down, how to appreciate the simple beauty in the world around him. It wasn't long before Elijah knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. He had never been one for grand gestures, but for Lila, he planned the perfect proposal. Under the stars, in the very field where they had shared their first kiss. She said yes, of course, her eyes brimming with tears of joy as they made promises to each other that seemed unbreakable. But life has a cruel way of unraveling even the most beautiful of dreams. It started with a cough. At first, they both brushed it off as nothing, a minor cold that would pass with time. But the cough lingered, growing worse with each passing day. Lila, always the optimist, assured Elijah that she was fine, that there was no need to worry. But deep down, Elijah knew something was wrong. The vibrant, energetic woman he had fallen in love with was fading before his eyes, her once bright smile dimming with each breath she struggled to take. By the time they sought medical help, it was too late. The diagnosis was devastating, an aggressive form of cancer that had already spread. The doctors offered little hope, their words heavy with sympathy but devoid of solutions. Elijah was furious, not at them, but at the universe itself. How could this happen? How could someone as pure and full of life as Lila be taken away from him so soon? The months that followed were a blur of hospital visits, treatments, and sleepless nights. Elijah did everything he could to save her, sparing no expense in seeking out the best doctors and the most cutting-edge treatments. But money couldn't stop the inevitable. Lila's condition worsened, and there was nothing anyone could do. In her final days, Lila remained as strong as ever, comforting Elijah even as her own body betrayed her. She told him not to be sad, that they had been lucky to have found each other, even if their time together was brief. But Elijah couldn't accept it. He wasn't ready to say goodbye. How could he be, when she was his entire world? The day she passed, Elijah felt as though his heart had been ripped from his chest. The grief was unbearable, suffocating. He had never known pain like that before. In the days and weeks that followed, he shut himself off from the world, drowning in his sorrow. The life they had planned together was gone, and Elijah was left with nothing but memories. He visited her grave every week, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes just sitting in silence, lost in his thoughts. The cemetery became a place of solace for him, a quiet refuge where he could feel close to her. It was there, surrounded by the stillness of the dead, that Elijah found some semblance of peace. But the emptiness never truly left him. As the years passed, Elijah threw himself into his work, using it as a way to numb the pain. He built an empire, becoming one of the most powerful men in the city, but no amount of success could fill the void Lila had left behind. He never remarried, never allowed himself to get close to anyone again. His heart belonged to her, even in death. But the loneliness was always there, lurking in the background, a constant reminder of what he had lost. Sometimes, late at night, He would pull out the letters Lila had written him during their time together, reading over her words as if they could somehow bring her back. He could still hear her voice in his mind, soft and full of love, telling him that everything would be okay. But it wasn't okay. It hadn't been okay since the day she died. That's why, when Elijah met Evelyn all those years later, something in him stirred. He didn't realize it at the time, but the encounter with the homeless woman brought back memories of Lila, memories he had tried so hard to bury. There was something about Evelyn's eyes, the way they reflected a kind of sadness that felt all too familiar. It reminded him of the days he had spent by Lila's side, watching helplessly as the life drained out of her. 4 days after giving Evelyn the money, Elijah couldn't stop thinking about her. He wondered where she had come from, how she had ended up on the streets. He thought about the way she had looked at him, with a mixture of gratitude and despair. There was a depth to her pain that resonated with him, though he couldn't quite explain why. He found himself returning to the same street corner, hoping to catch another glimpse of her. But she was never there. The alleyway where she had sat was empty, as if she had vanished into thin air. It frustrated Elijah more than he cared to admit. He wanted answers, though he wasn't sure what questions he was even asking. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Elijah sat alone in his penthouse apartment, a glass of whiskey in hand. The city stretched out before him, glittering and vibrant, but he felt utterly disconnected from it. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his mind drifting back to Lila once again. He missed her. Even after all these years, the ache in his chest hadn't dulled. It was as if a part of him had died with her, leaving him incomplete. He thought about the last conversation they had before she passed. Lila had been too weak to speak much, her voice barely more than a whisper. But she had held his hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "Promise me something," she had said, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his heart ache. "Anything," Elijah had replied, his voice breaking. "Promise me you won't close yourself off," she had continued. Don't let my death define you. You have so much love to give, Elijah. Don't waste it." He had promised, of course. But in the years that followed, he had done exactly the opposite. He had built walls around his heart, walls so high and impenetrable that no one could get in, not even him. Elijah finished his drink and set the glass down, the sound of it hitting the table echoing through the empty room. He stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the city lights. He wondered what Lila would think of the man he had become. Would she be proud of his success, or disappointed that he had lost the parts of himself she had loved most? As he stood there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed on the table behind him. He ignored it at first, but the buzzing persisted, pulling him out of his reverie. Sighing, he walked back to the table and picked up the phone. It was a message from his assistant, reminding him of a charity event he had agreed to attend the following evening. Elijah had forgotten all about it. He wasn't in the mood for a party, especially one where he would be expected to smile and shake hands with people who only cared about his money. But the event was for a good cause, an organization that helped homeless families get back on their feet. And after meeting Evelyn, he felt a strange sense of obligation to go. The next evening, Elijah arrived at the event, dressed in a tailored suit that had cost more than most people made in a year. The room was filled with the city's elite, all sipping champagne and engaging in shallow conversation. Elijah made his rounds, smiling politely and exchanging pleasantries, but his mind was elsewhere. It wasn't until the speeches began that Elijah's attention was drawn back to the present. The head of the charity took the stage, speaking passionately about the work they were doing to combat homelessness. As the man spoke, Elijah's thoughts returned to Evelyn. The evening air was thick with tension as Elijah Evans sat alone in his study, a glass of untouched whiskey on the desk in front of him. The flickering flames from the fireplace cast shadows across the room, their warm glow doing little to thaw the coldness that had settled in his chest. For days, something had been gnawing at him, an unshakable feeling of unease that he couldn't quite explain. His encounter with Evelyn, the homeless woman, had stirred something deep within him, something he had tried to suppress for years. He had tried to move on, to forget the strange pull he felt toward her, but it was impossible. No matter how hard he tried to focus on his business deals or his ever-growing empire, his mind kept drifting back to that moment, the moment when her eyes had met his and something unspoken had passed between them. It wasn't just pity, he realized now. It was something far deeper, something that felt disturbingly personal. Weeks had passed since he had last seen her, and in that time, Elijah had tried to track her down, hoping to find answers to the questions that plagued him. He had sent his private investigator to search the streets, had even gone back to the alleyway himself, but there had been no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin AI. Elijah sat there, lost in his thoughts. The sound of the front door creaking open reached his ears. He frowned, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was late, too late for visitors. A moment later, he heard the soft footsteps of his housekeeper approaching the study. "Sir," she called out, her voice hesitant, "there's a man here to see you." Elijah's frown deepened. "At this hour?" "Yes, sir. He says it's important." With a sigh, Elijah pushed his chair back and stood up. He wasn't in the mood for company, but something in the housekeeper's tone told him this wasn't just a social call. "Send him in," he said, his voice heavy with impatience. A few moments later, the door to the study opened, and a man stepped inside. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and sharp features. His clothes were worn and tattered, but there was an air of dignity about him, as if he carried himself with purpose despite his disheveled appearance. Elijah's gaze narrowed. "Who are you?" The man looked at him for a long moment, his eyes filled with something Elijah couldn't quite place, something that made his skin prickle. "My name is Henry," the man said finally, his voice low and gravelly, "and I believe I have information that you might find interesting." Elijah crossed his arms over his chest, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "What kind of information?" "About the woman you've been looking for," Henry said, his eyes never leaving Elijah's. "The one you met on the street a few weeks ago, Evelyn." At the mention of her name, Elijah felt his heart skip a beat. "You know her?" Henry nodded slowly. "I do, but more importantly, I know her story, and I think it's time you knew it too." Elijah stared at the man, a million questions racing through his mind. He had expected this search to lead to dead ends, to more unanswered questions. But now, standing in front of him was someone who claimed to have the answers he sought. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down." Henry nodded and took a seat, his movements slow and deliberate. Elijah returned to his own chair, his eyes fixed on the man. "Tell me," he said, his voice steady, though he could feel the tension building inside him. "Tell me everything." Henry took a deep breath, his gaze dropping to the floor as if gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost as if he was telling a secret meant for Elijah's ears alone. "Her name wasn't always Evelyn," Henry began, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest of the chair. "She was born Annabelle Keats. She grew up in a small town not far from here, in a family that, by all accounts, was quite well off. Her father was a prominent businessman, her mother a socialite. Annabelle had everything a girl could want. She was beautiful, bright, and destined for a life of privilege." Elijah leaned forward, intrigued by the story. He couldn't reconcile the image of the fragile, broken woman he had met with the picture Henry was painting of Annabelle. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry's eyes darkened. "Love happened," he said bitterly, or at least what she thought was love. Elijah frowned, his mind racing. He had always believed that love was the most powerful force in the world, the thing that had kept him going even after Lila's death. But in Henry's voice, love sounded like a curse, a destructive force that had brought nothing but pain. "She fell in love with a man her family didn't approve of," Henry continued. "He was a poet, a dreamer. Not the kind of man her parents wanted for their daughter. But Annabelle was stubborn. She believed in her heart that he was the one, that they could build a life together despite the odds." Elijah felt a strange pang of recognition. It sounded so much like his own story, the one he had shared with Lila. He had been the dreamer, the one who had believed that love could conquer all. And for a time it had. "But things didn't go as planned," Henry said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Her parents disowned her when she refused to leave him. They cut her off financially, and she was forced to leave the only life she had ever known. She and the poet moved to the city, where they tried to make a life together. But poverty wears on a person, even the strongest of loves. The man she had given up everything for began to change. He became bitter, resentful. He blamed her for their circumstances, for the life he could no longer give her. Elijah felt a knot forming in his stomach. He could see where the story was going, and it filled him with a sense of dread. One day, he left, Henry said, his voice barely more than a whisper. He walked out on her, leaving her with nothing. No money, no home, no way to survive. Annabelle was alone in a city that didn't care whether she lived or died. She fell into despair, and before long, she found herself on the streets. Elijah closed his eyes, the weight of the story settling over him like a heavy blanket. He could see it all so clearly. The young woman, full of hope and love, watching as her world crumbled around her. He could feel her pain, her sense of betrayal. She tried to get back on her feet, Henry said, but the city is unforgiving. She lost everything, her dignity, her pride. She became one of the invisible, one of the countless souls wandering the streets, forgotten by the world. Elijah opened his eyes and looked at Henry, his chest tight with emotion. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice rough. Henry met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Because you need to understand who she is," he said. "You need to understand why you felt that connection to her. It wasn't just pity, Elijah. It was something deeper." Elijah's heart raced as he stared at Henry, his mind spinning. "What do you mean?" Henry leaned forward, his voice low. "Evelyn, Annabelle, is connected to you in ways you can't even imagine." Elijah's breath caught in his throat. "How?" Henry hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "She knew someone you loved, someone who was very important to you." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. "Who?" Henry's eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, Elijah felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. Lila. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Elijah's mind reeled, his thoughts crashing into each other in a whirlwind of confusion. "Lila," he whispered, barely able to speak. "How? How could she have known Lila?" Henry sighed, his expression pained. Lila and Annabelle crossed paths many years ago, before either of them had fallen into the lives they ended up living. They were both young, both in love, both filled with dreams for the future. But their stories took very different turns. Elijah felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. His mind struggled to comprehend the connection between the two women, the two loves of his life. One lost to death, the other lost to the streets. They met by chance, Henry continued, in a park, of all places. They struck up a conversation, and over time, they became friends. They shared their hopes, their fears, their struggles. Lila never knew the full extent of what Annabelle was going through, but she sensed the darkness that was creeping into her friend's life. Elijah's throat tightened as he listened to Henry's words. He could picture it so clearly, Lila, with her endless compassion, reaching out to someone in need. It was so like her, to see the good in people, even when the world was closing in around them. Lila tried to help her, Henry said. She offered her support, even gave her money when she could. But Annabelle was too proud, too ashamed of what her life had become. She pushed Lila away, convinced that she didn't deserve her kindness. Elijah's chest ached with a mix of sorrow and anger. He wanted to reach back in time, to change things, to save both of them from the fates that had befallen them. When Lila died, Henry said softly, Annabelle was devastated. She blamed herself for not being there for her friend, for not accepting the help that had been offered. It broke something in her, something that had already been fragile. Elijah stared at the man in front of him, his mind spinning. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process the revelation that had just been laid before him. All he knew was that his world had been shattered once again. Henry stood up slowly, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said quietly, "but you needed to know the truth. You needed to understand why you felt that connection to her." Elijah remained silent, his thoughts too chaotic to form a response. Henry walked toward the door, pausing just before he left. "She's still out there, Elijah," he said softly, "and she needs your help." With that, the door closed behind him, leaving Elijah alone in the flickering light of the fireplace. The weight of the truth pressing down on him like a vice, he sat there for what felt like hours, staring into the flames, his mind consumed by the intertwining fates of the two women who had changed his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. Elijah Evans sat motionless in his leather chair, the soft creak of its well-worn surface the only sound in the vast study. The fire, once roaring, had dulled to glowing embers, casting faint, flickering shadows across the walls. He hadn't moved since Henry had left, and the weight of the man's words still clung to the air like a dense fog. Lila, Evelyn, Annabelle had known Lila. It felt as though the universe had woven some impossibly complex web around him, a web that had taken years to reveal itself. The revelation threatened to tear him apart from the inside out. How could it be possible? How could the two most important women in his life be linked by more than just his own memories? His mind raced, searching for answers, for connections he hadn't seen before. He could picture Lila, her gentle smile, her laugh that had once filled his home with warmth. The memory of her was bittersweet, a comfort and a curse. And now, there was another layer to that memory, another person tied to her, to him, and to the long-buried past. Evelyn, or Annabelle, as Henry had called her, had been on the periphery of his life for years. He hadn't known it, hadn't understood it, but she had been there, watching, waiting. Her existence intertwined with his in ways he couldn't have imagined. And now, after so many years of living in the shadows, she was back, her presence stirring up emotions he thought he had buried long ago. But what did it mean? Why had fate brought her back into his life now, after all this time? And what was he supposed to do with this newfound knowledge? The questions swirled in his mind, unanswered and relentless. He reached for the glass of whiskey on the desk in front of him, the liquid long since gone warm. He drank it in one quick motion, the burn doing little to numb the confusion and anxiety that gripped him. He needed answers. He needed to find her. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The streets were quiet, bathed in the dim glow of street lamps that stretched along the cobblestone alleyways. Elijah's footsteps echoed as he made his way through the city, his mind focused on one thing: Evelyn. He didn't know where she was, but he had a feeling she wouldn't have gone far. There was something about the city, something that kept people like her bound to it, even when it offered them nothing but hardship. He passed familiar buildings, places he had walked by 1,000 times before without a second thought. Now, every corner seemed to hold a secret, every alleyway a possible clue. He felt as though the city was playing tricks on him, hiding what he sought just out of reach. Finally, after what felt like hours, he found himself standing in front of the same alley where he had first seen her. The memory was vivid in his mind. The moment their eyes had met, the strange pull he had felt toward her, the recognition he hadn't been able to explain. He stepped into the alley, the shadows closing in around him. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and decay. The remnants of lives lived in the margins. He glanced around, searching for any sign of her, any hint that she might still be here. And then he saw it, a small figure huddled against the wall, hidden in the darkness. His heart raced as he approached, the sound of his footsteps causing the figure to stir. "Evelyn," he called softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure shifted, and a pair of weary eyes met his. It was her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. She looked different than he remembered, thinner, frilier, as if the weight of the world had finally become too much for her to bear. But her eyes were the same. There was a sadness in them, yes, but also something else, something that drew him in just as it had before. "I've been looking for you," Elijah said, his voice gentle, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment between them. Evelyn didn't respond at first, her gaze drifting away from him as if she didn't quite believe he was real. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Why?" It was a simple question, but one that carried the weight of years of pain and isolation. Elijah swallowed hard, unsure of how to answer. He didn't fully understand it himself. Why had he been so determined to find her? Why had he felt so compelled to uncover her story, to learn who she really was? "Because I needed to," he said quietly. "Because there's something between us. Something I don't understand, but I can't ignore." Evelyn's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions: fear, confusion, hope. "You don't owe me anything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm just a woman you met on the street." Elijah shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "You're more than that. You're connected to me, to Lila." At the mention of Lila's name, Evelyn's expression changed. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, Elijah thought she might bolt, flee from the conversation and disappear into the night. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed where she was, her body tense, as if bracing herself for what was to come. "How do you know about Lila?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elijah took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "Henry told me," he said. "He told me everything. About you. About her. About how your lives crossed paths all those years ago." Evelyn's face paled, her breath hitching in her throat. "He shouldn't have, he did," Elijah said softly. "And I'm glad he did, because now I understand. I understand why I felt so drawn to you that day. It wasn't just coincidence. It was fate." Evelyn looked away, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of Elijah's words was too much for her to bear. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaky. "You don't know what I've been through, what I've done." Elijah stepped closer, his gaze soft but unwavering. "I know more than you think," he said gently. "I know you've suffered. I know you've lost everything. But I also know that you were once friends with the woman I loved more than anything in this world. And that means something to me. That means you're not just a stranger. You're part of my story too." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes, and for a moment, Elijah thought she might let them fall. But she didn't. Instead, she blinked them away, her expression hardening. "You don't want me in your story," she said bitterly. "I'm nothing but a ghost. A reminder of things better left forgotten." Elijah shook his head, his voice firm. "That's not true. You're not a ghost. You're a survivor. And I'm not going to walk away from you just because it's easier to pretend you don't exist." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something. Answers, perhaps, or reassurance. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet and fragile. "What do you want from me?" "I want to help you," Elijah said softly. "I don't know how yet, but I want to try. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Evelyn's lips trembled, and for the first time since they had met, Elijah saw a crack in her carefully constructed armor. "I don't know how to be helped," she whispered. "I've been alone for so long." "You don't have to be," Elijah said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Not anymore." For a long moment, they stood there in the silence of the alley, the weight of their shared past hanging between them. And in that moment, something shifted. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. A small spark of hope, a tiny flicker of possibility. Evelyn didn't say anything more. She simply nodded, a small, tentative gesture that told Elijah all he needed to know. It was enough for now, enough to build on. Without another word, he offered her his hand. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly, cautiously, she reached out and took it, and together, they stepped out of the shadows and into the light. The following weeks passed in a blur. Elijah brought Evelyn into his home, not permanently, but just for now, as he liked to say, even though they both knew there was no real timeline. She needed a place to stay, a place where she could find some semblance of stability, and Elijah's house, sprawling and full of empty rooms, was the obvious choice. At first, things were awkward between them. Evelyn was used to fending for herself, and the sudden shift to living in a house with all the comforts she had once taken for granted felt strange. She didn't know how to relax, didn't know how to accept the help Elijah so freely offered. But slowly, she began to adjust. The walls she had built around herself, the defenses she had relied on for years, began to crumble. She still had her moments. Moments when the weight of her past pressed down on her, threatening to drag her back into the darkness. But Elijah was always there, always patient, always understanding. And as the days turned into weeks, a fragile bond began to form between them. It wasn't the same as the connection Elijah had shared with Lila. It never could be, but it was something real. As they spent more time together, Elijah began to learn more about Evelyn's past, about the life she had led before everything had fallen apart. She spoke of her friendship with Lila, of the days when they had been inseparable, two girls with dreams of a brighter future. But those dreams had been shattered by the harsh realities of life, and Evelyn had been left to pick up the pieces alone. Elijah listened, never judging, never pressing her for more than she was willing to share. He simply offered her a space to heal, a place where she could begin to rebuild the life she had lost. And slowly, Evelyn began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a future again. But as they both knew all too well, the past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you try to run from it.